Hello and welcome to the Sierra Speaker Series, brought to you by California State Parks and the Sierra State Parks Foundation. My name is Jeremy Lin, and I'm the Natural and Cultural Interpreter based at Donner Memorial State Park. The Sierra Speaker Series shares and connects the rich cultural and natural history of the area to the community. Please donate to Sierra State Parks Foundation today to support the interpretation, restoration, and preservation of the park system in the Lake Tahoe-Donner area. Your tax-deductible donation will be kept locally and applied to priority projects. Please visit sierrastateparks.org to see how you can get involved and access a full list of upcoming events. With me today is Jerry Blackwell. Jerry is president of the Truckee-Donner Railroad Society and acting chair of the New Museum of Truckee History. He has done research, written articles, and made presentations about the Transcontinental Railroad, the Truckee to Lake Tahoe Railroad, and the area's logging railroads. He also teaches economics at Truckee's Sierra College. Previously, he was board president of the Sierra State Parks Foundation. Today, Jerry will be presenting his renowned and extremely relevant talk titled The Chinese, Heroes of the Transcontinental Railroad. Thank you, Jerry, for being here, and please take it away.
Okay, I'd like to tell you the story about the Chinese railroad workers who built the Transcontinental Railroad. I'd like to tell you why they were hired, how they were hired, what they did once they got on the railroad, and what they did after the railroad was completed. So the Big Four had a problem. The Big Four were Collis Huntington, Leland Stanford, Charles Crocker, and Mark Hopkins. Their problem was they were in a race with the Union Pacific. The Union Pacific was actually looking very, very good in this race because they had gone 250 miles towards the west from Omaha, Nebraska, while the Central Pacific, the railroad the Big Four owned, had only gone 30 miles from Sacramento into the Sierras. One of their biggest problems related to this slow work was because they could not keep good workers on the job. They would hire European Americans from the area. 60% of them would work a short time on the railroad and then decide that there were other things they could do that were easier work, like going to the Comstock mines and working there in Virginia City. So they had to figure out how to solve this problem. Charles Crocker was the man who actually was the supervisor of the railroad. He came up with an idea about using some of the Chinese gold miners who were discouraged from making gold, going for gold. They weren't making enough money. And he thought, well, maybe we could hire these people. So he went to his foreman, a man by the name of James Stowbridge, and said, okay, I think we should hire some of these Chinese workers. They might work out quite well. Well, Stowbridge said, no, they're too small, they're too frail, they just can't do the heavy work that's required building a railroad. And supposedly Crocker said, well, they built the Great Wall of China, didn't they? And well, Stowbridge didn't have a lot of choice. He couldn't get enough workers. And so he thought, okay, I'll go along with my boss and see if these guys would work out. And so he went out and he hired about 20 Chinese workers from here in California. And it worked very, very well. They ended up working so well that they started hiring all the workers from China who had come in from China throughout California. And they got up close to 4,000 workers that they'd hired from the Chinese that were still in California. Then they had another problem. And of course, they ran out of available Chinese workers in California. So what do you do when you run out of Chinese workers in California? Well, you go to China. That's where all the Chinese workers were. And they went to an area around present-day Hong Kong called Guangdong Province. And Guangdong Province was an interesting area because the emperor had actually told the Western powers that they had to limit their influence to that particular area in around present-day Hong Kong. In fact, there was a major city there by the name of Canton, and to the Europeans, it was really Guangzhou. And so, so he said, okay, if you're going into China, you have to stay in this Guangdong province. And so China had been having a number of problems with the Europeans. And so they had begun to put in some fairly repressive measures. The Chinese citizens, actually, who lived in Guangdong province. Some of the Chinese farmers had already heard about the California gold rush. It had been called Gold Mountain in Chinese. And so some of them had already gone to China, from China to California. And when they got to California, they wrote letters back. And so many of the Chinese knew the story of how things were going in China. So into this environment came a labor contractor from Central Pacific Railroad. He was actually a Dutchman from Indonesia, but he had in his agreement that if the Chinese would go ahead and make the journey across the Pacific, the railroad would pay for their journey. Once they got on the ships, they would pay for the long passage, and in fact, when they got to California, why then they would work on the railroad long enough first to pay for their passage. If they wanted to work longer, then they certainly had the right to work longer, and then they would use their money both for food as well as savings. And so they made it a very attractive prospect. And then he threw in a nice other little kicker, which was if they happened to be killed while they were working on the railroad, why their bones would be transported back to China to be buried in their homeland. So a number of them decided, okay, let's go do this. Let's go to China. Let's go from China. Hong Kong, and in fact, was a port that was being used to San Francisco. This was like a 30 or 40-day journey, 11,000 miles across the Pacific. And when they got to San Francisco, they might be met by representatives of 6 Chinese companies, all composed of Chinese Americans. Later on, the railroad would also meet with them. And so they would get them through customs and into the railroad and all the way to the railroad to get from Sacramento to San Francisco, or both ways. They had to get ferry boats from San Francisco. They went up the Sacramento River and stopped there at the port of Sacramento. So there were that was one way. There were other ways to get to Sacramento from San Francisco at the time. So the workers got to the workplace. Then Crocker and Stourbridge organized them into groups of maybe 12 to 20 workers. They would have one lead man, a Chinaman, who would actually be able to speak English. And then they'd have an Irish American, usually an Irish American, who would be in overall charge of them and give them the tasks that they would work on each day. That lead man had a special position because it was his job to both get the money from the Central Pacific Railroad. His name was the only name on the books of the Central Pacific Railroad. He would be given money for the workers that it was proven that he had. And then it was also his job to buy food for those workers to be sure that they were well fed on the trip. So they were all organized. They were ready to go, ready to start working. Just to give you an idea of how they compared with the available California workmen, Crocker actually testified before Congress that they were reliable and hardworking, where 3 out of 5 men quit if they were the other available workers. They were sober. On Sundays they rested, did washing, and maybe a little gambling. However, the other American workers might drink whiskey and maybe be unfit for work on Monday. And they were cheaper. And if at one time, if you looked at the books, they were being paid $28 a month, while other American workers were being paid $30 a month to do the same things. But for that $30 a month, the railroad was averaging another $22 a month for those workers for food and board, while the Chinese were taking their $28 and paying for their own food. So there was essentially a difference between the workers of $28 for the Chinese and $52 for the other American workers. So they were much cheaper, plus they were a much healthier workforce. They were a much healthier workforce because they would eat things like rice and noodles, dried seafood, dried vegetables and fruit, bamboo shoots, seaweed, peanut oil, and the like, where the California workman would maybe have more of a high carbohydrate, high protein beef, beans, potatoes, bread, butter, things like that. And of course, they boiled water for tea, which killed the microorganisms in the water, where the other workers might just dip a cup into the stream and drink it out, risking dysentery. So there was a cheaper, more sober, and healthier workforce with the Chinese. And they needed a workforce like that because the distance from Sacramento up to Reno, up through the Sierras, was a very, very difficult time to build a railroad. Whole area, very, very difficult. To give you a little bit of idea of how much easier it is to build a railroad in the flat versus building a railroad over the Sierras, it took 4 years to build 154 miles from Sacramento to Reno, where once they got on the flat, the same kind of a flat that the Union Pacific Railroad was on, but once they got on that, why it only took a year to go across the 400 miles of Reno to northern Utah, Promontory Summit, which is just north of the Great Salt Lake. So they had a much bigger challenge than the Union Pacific had. And part of the challenge was the challenge of the small locomotives. The small wood and coal-burning locomotives didn't have much power to get up over mountains, to pull a train up over those mountains. And in addition, when the Pacific Railroad Act of 1861 was passed, it actually specified a slope that would be the maximum slope. But the way they said the slope was, it sort of sounded strange. What they said, it can't be a slope that's more than the maximum slope of the Baltimore and Ohio main line. Well, that was a problem. What's the maximum slope of the Baltimore and Ohio main line? So the railroaders went around and looked at some of the best group of civil engineers in the United States at the time, and this was the Army Corps of Engineers. And they got a very bright young commissioned officer to go out and measure that particular slope. And he came back and said, well, the slope is 2.5%. That's 25 feet for every 1,000 feet on the horizontal. So 25 feet up for every 1,000 feet on the horizontal. That man was named McClellan. I think we've all heard of McClellan Airport near Sacramento, as well as he didn't do too well in the Civil War. He rose to the rank of general, and then Lincoln fired him because he didn't do the kind of job that should be done. But this was the problem, building a railroad where you had to keep a 2.5% grade. So when you have that sort of a limitation, some of the things you have to worry about is how do you get across a canyon? You build a trestle. How do you get across a small valley? You can fill that in. How do you get around a mountain? Well, you have to chip a roadbed around a mountain, and finally, at some point, you have to start tunneling. So the other thing that we were curious about these people, how did they live? And for the most part, they didn't live in very pleasant conditions. They might have tents, or they might have sort of a wooden teepee lean-to kind of a thing. If they were in a temporary works camp, or if they were in a more permanent work camp, they might have a little shack or something like that, where a number of them would live in that little shack. Also, they were, of course, supported. Their food was brought up for the most part by train. This was the food that was bought by their lead man. And in addition to that, why they might have other services, Chinese doctors would come up and treat the ailments that they might have, and they might have some other services of various people coming up along the railroad selling that to them. Well, as they worked their way up, they came up to a mountain that was a very, very difficult mountain to get around. It was about 2,000 feet above the American River. If you take Interstate 80 from Truckee down to Colfax, just this side of Colfax, there's a railroad tunnel that goes across Interstate 80, a railroad trestle that goes across Interstate 80, and that railroad trestle south of that is Cape Horn. It's a funny name to be Cape Horn, and it was named by some of the railroad supervisors and the civil engineers who actually came from the east coast of the United States down around Cape Horn, the tip of South America, and then up to San Francisco. This was a much more difficult route than the Chinese had, actually. It took them twice as long. It took them over 90 days to sail from the East Coast to the West Coast. And it was also an 18,000 mile trip. But they named it Cape Horn. And so the workers began to work on it. There was one story that perhaps the Chinese were put in wicker baskets and lowered down the side. One historian that did a lot of work on this went out and looked at the slope, and he said it's only about a 75-degree slope, so it's unlikely that they had wicker baskets. There's been another historian who more recently came up with a story that, oh yeah, they used wicker baskets. I personally don't think they used wicker baskets, although they may have had a rope tied around their waist sometimes when they had to go down and start the initial explosives. But off they went. They made it around Cape Horn, and then their next big challenge was working across the Sierras, maintaining that 2.5% grade all the way to the summit of the Sierras. And you'd see them out working, say, in the case of building filling it in across a gully, why there'd be a Chinaman whose job it was to use his shovel, fill up the bucket, fill up the barrels, the wheelbarrows. The wheelbarrows would be picked up by another Chinaman who could run it over to the side of the roadbed. He'd dump it back to pick up another load. And they just continually did this until they had the railroad roadbed and track laid all the way up to the top of the Sierras, to the summit of the Sierras. Well, once they got to the granite of the Sierras, they really did have a problem. They could not do any of the other things that they'd been able to do before. Here they had to start constructing the tunnels. And this was hard work. The Chinese, who had come from a tropical area of Guangdong province, where the temperature maybe got up into the high 80s, low 90s, and maybe sometime it got down to the low 50s, all of a sudden they were up in the winter of the Sierras. They were in lots of snow. In some cases, they'd have to burrow through 30 foot of snow just to get to the face of the tunnel where they could do their work. So this was very, very hard work, and it was different than anything these Chinese had experienced before. And as the work went along, the Crocker and Strobridge realized that going through these tunnels was going to take a lot longer, especially the tunnel that was at the summit. This was called Tunnel 6. Tunnel 6 was going to be 1,659 feet long. It would end up being the longest tunnel in the whole transcontinental railroad when it was first completed. And as they started from the east and west faces, they'd work in, but this was not going fast enough, so they decided that they would drop a vertical shaft from the middle of the tunnel, and then once they got down to the roadbed level, then they would actually have 2 more faces to work on the tunnel. This was difficult work. This was 24-hour-a-day work. It was divided into 3 shifts of 8 hours each. So when the Chinese workers would start their shift, they'd ride buckets or platforms down to the work site in the shaft. When they got there, there'd be a lot of rubble from the previous workforce. That they would then put all that rubble into the buckets. The buckets would be taken up to the top of the hill, where they would be pushed over, dropped out, and put down to be refilled. So when they finally finished taking all the rubble out, then the next thing they had to do is they had to start actually putting crevasses, putting holes in the ground so they could fill this up with black powder. So they actually had long chisel-like things that they would hold, one man would hold, and 2 other Chinamen would hit it with sledgehammers, and then until they would have a hole big enough to fill it up with black powder. Then they'd put fuses in there, and then once all the fuses were put in, then all but 1 worker would get into the buckets, go back up to the surface, and 1 worker would wait for the bucket to come back down. Once it was back down, he'd light all the fuses, jump on the bucket, give the signal to get on up, get all the way up, and when he got all the way up, why, there'd be an explosion below him, and that they were all ready for the next shift. Well, even that was not fast enough for Crocker and Strobridge, and so they thought about using nitroglycerin. Initially, the railroad thought, well, that'd be a good idea, so they arranged to have some nitroglycerin shipped to the railroad, and it was had reached a Wells Fargo office in downtown San Francisco on Market Street. And one of the Wells Fargo clerks looked over and noticed there was a clear liquid coming out of the back. So he went over and he opened up the box. Well, the subsequent explosion totally killed everybody and destroyed the Wells Fargo office, plus it killed a number of people in a luncheon club right next to it. What happened after that was the California state legislature said, okay, we're passing a law. There'll be no more nitroglycerin transported in the state of California. So the railroad said, well, I guess that's it. Until about a year later, a chemist from Britain by the name of Howden showed up and said, look, I know how to formulate nitroglycerin. I can do it in a lab near the summit, and once I do that, why, then I can, then you can take it in vials down to wherever it's needed, and then use it to go ahead and build this. Had the advantage, it built smaller holes. It was more explosive, and it moved more granite out of the way. So it actually doubled the speed. Well, you say doubled the speed. When they were working, they were getting about 1 foot on each face with black powder. So by doubling it, they got almost 2 feet black on each face a day. So it still wasn't going very fast, but it was moving along a little bit faster than it had before. Well, while all this was going on in the tunnels, the Big Four had actually arranged to have a wagon road to be constructed along the parallel to the roadbed. And they started out in Dutch Flat and went all the way to Reno, Truckee Meadows. And they did it for a number of reasons, 3 reasons. The first reason was they wanted to have some equipment and supplies that they could take on up to the work on the railroad. And so that was very useful. A second reason was it was a toll road. And as a toll road, it turned out to be very popular. It was the best road at the time for Teamsters who were on their way to the Virginia City mines. And so they would pay the tolls and take that road. And that helped the Big Four because the Big Four were strapped for cash at that time. They were able to issue government-backed bonds, but they hadn't been moving fast enough to get a sufficient number of bonds to cover their costs. So this was very important. But the third and very important reason was the road actually went down to Truckee. And in Truckee, they started building an island railroad. This railroad actually was designed to go both east and west of Truckee. So on the Dutch Flat Road, they would take 3 locomotives. They may have taken some in the winter on skids, but they would take it over the road. Plus, they took rails, they took spikes, and they took equipment to build railroad flat cars for the work train. So this was a major effort, and so once everything was assembled in Truckee, why then the Chinese there began to lay track both east and west. And the east was up towards Coldstream Canyon, right here in Donner State Park. And so, and of course, that was going towards the tunnels up at the top of the summit, and then going out into Nevada. So that was working on fairly well for the railroad. So finally, in 1867, the first tunnel, the most difficult tunnel, was completed. And once the Chinese workers blasted through there, they still had other tunnels that they had to complete between Donner Summit 6 and the other tunnels that finally got to Coldstream Canyon around a couple of bends. But they continued to work on those. And finally, in 1868, they broke through that final tunnel into Coldstream Canyon, and the other tunnels came up from Truckee. The track came up from Truckee, and with that completion, the first passenger train came up from Sacramento the following day. It was actually pulled by this locomotive, the Antelope. It had a boxcar and 3 passenger cars, and they loaded it with dignitaries at 6:30 in the morning in Sacramento, and it worked its way up the mountain, stopping at each of the towns, celebrating the fact that this was almost completed, or that at least the run to Reno was completed. When it probably got to Truckee about 6 o'clock at night, and then they finally got to Reno somewhere around 8 o'clock at night. So it turned out that would be a regular passenger run, about 9.5 hours on the schedule. And in those days, those dollars would be about $15 that you could then ride from Sacramento to Reno. So that was the first real passenger passenger earning train that the Big Four had. Well, now that we're out in Nevada, and when looking across Nevada, this was fairly easy territory. One of the interesting things that there was a rumor, and I'm not sure who started the rumor, whether it was the Indians in Nevada or Union Pacific people or something like that, but they were telling the Chinese that there were gigantic cannibals in Nevada, and these cannibals would be so bad that they might even eat up the Chinese. Well, some of the Chinese believed the story and said, I'm out of here. And so that back they went either to China or to the Sacramento River Valley. Other Chinese said, well, it doesn't quite sound reasonable. And so the bulk of the workforce stayed on. And when they finally met up with the Indians, they found out that they were just like them, that was a totally made up story. So anyway, there they finally got up very close to meeting up with the Union Pacific. So they were actually in Utah, just north of the Great Salt Lake. They had arranged to both stop construction at a point just north of the Great Salt Lake called Promontory Summit. And but before they actually finished this up, why Thomas Durant, who was the vice president of Union Pacific, and probably really more than a vice president, he decided he'd make a bet because he'd been watching how good his workers were. And he decided that he'd bet, okay, my Union Pacific workers can lay more track in a day than your Central Pacific workers can. And he was quite confident he could. Thomas Durant sort of had a reputation, somewhat of a sleaze. He was later accused of bribing senators and congressmen, as well as doing some really shady things in real estate along the Union Pacific right-of-way. But when he proposed this bet, $10,000, that's over $170,000 in today's money. Why, he bet Crocker $10,000 that his workers could lay more track in a day. Well, Crocker said, fine, I'll take you up on that. But Crocker was a little bit cagey. And so he waited until the two railroads were less than 20 miles apart. And then just a day before they reached that point, he had arranged for all the rails, all the ties, and all the spikes to be laid out and to have all the workers all ready at 5:30 in the morning, ready to go. They had some 4,000 Chinese, about 8 Irish American who were the actual track layers who positioned it. And this whole group was all ready to go. Off they went. They spent the whole day working till about 7:30 at night, and they covered over 10 miles in one day. Well, Union Pacific didn't have 10 miles left, so Crocker won his bet, which I sort of like the story because Thomas Durant was such a sleazeball. I love to hear anything that happened to him in that way. So the two railroads finally met there at the summit, and this is a picture. The Central Pacific Railroad was a wood burner. It had that big wide stack, and the Union Pacific Railroad was a coal burner. It had a narrow stack. So here you see the Central Pacific on the left, the Union Pacific on the right. And you can see all the dignitaries that had been summoned there, both from the West Coast as well as the East Coast. And Leland Stanford had the job of tapping in the Golden Spike, and Thomas Durant represented the Union Pacific to tap in their spikes. There were actually 4 spikes. I think 3 of them were gold, and 1 of them was a mix of gold and silver. Oh no, one was gold, 2 were gold, 1 was silver, and 1 was a mix. And so these spikes were put in. Once this was done, a railroad telegrapher used Morse code, typed out the word "done," and it went up and down all along the lines, and there were celebrations throughout the United States celebrating the fact that, yes, this railroad, this transcontinental railroad has been completed. We are now united with the West Coast of the United States. But if you look at this picture and some other pictures, there are really, I don't think, any Chinese identified in these pictures. Not this picture so much. There was another picture that there might have been a couple of people who were Chinese, but you really couldn't see their faces for various reasons. So I'm not sure if that was true. There's one historian who seems to think that there was Chinese in the picture, and he may in fact be correct. But still, they were really well underrepresented. So about 10 years ago, a group of Chinese American descendants of the railroad workers went out to what's now the National Monument at Promontory Summit, Utah, where they have a replica of the two locomotives, and they restaged the photograph. Only this time, it's all Chinese. Finally, they got their recognition that really was needed on a broad basis. They were recognized to some extent by Strobridge. Strobridge, after the ceremony, actually asked the Chinese executives, Liebman, and some of the other owners of the Chinese American 6 companies to meet him in his own private car for a reception where he had other dignitaries, military men and the like, and newspaper reporters. And he gave the Chinese the credit for which they deserved. They were 90% of the workforce at that time. And so Strobridge knew what a contribution they made, and he told these people how big it was. And the newspaper reporters later filed reports, stories that said, yes, this was a big deal to have these Chinese executives and these American businessmen all sit down together. So that was pretty much the story. That was how it was completed. One of the questions that's been raised many times is how many were killed? The best estimate I've seen is maybe 1,000 Chinese were killed in the production of this railroad. The railroad did hold up to their agreement what had happened as people were killed, why the people who were killed were buried at the time, and then their bones were dug up later and transported back to China. There was one particularly bad instance in the winter of 1867-68 where there were just maybe 10,000 workers all up around Donner Summit. And huge snows had come through, and not just snows, but many avalanches. And so there were a number of camps, work camps, that were above Donner Lake. And one of them, an avalanche came down and killed quite a few of them. And they finally were able to get the bodies and the like. But that avalanche actually occurred near the place on the west end of Donner Memorial State Park called Chinese Cove, and that's why it was called Chinese Cove. It's a memorial to these Chinese that were killed in that avalanche. So what happened after the railroad was completed? Well, a number of things. They either ended up working for the railroad's maintenance crews, or they also worked for other railroads, and they also ended up establishing residences along the railway, along the Transcontinental Railroad, and both in Nevada, Truckee, and other places in California. A major employer at the time was the Central Pacific. They had section houses every 12 to 14 miles along the railroad to maintain the track. They hired about 30 Chinese in each one of these locations. There would be an Irish American who would be in charge of it. And these workers would work like 12-hour days, and at the end of the shift, while they might take hot baths, or they might play Chinese gongs and 3-string Chinese instruments. Major help to the railroad. Other railroad construction was also involved. The Virginia and Truckee Railroad was constructed from the main transcontinental railroad there at Reno, or Truckee Meadows, and it went on down to Carson City, and then went up the grade to the Comstock mines at Virginia City. The Chinese helped there a great deal. And then another major help that they contributed to was the railroad up in the Canadian Rockies, where the Canadian Pacific Railroad had just as much difficulty building their railroad over the Rockies as the Central Pacific over the Sierras. Major help there. Now, how are we sort of celebrating the fact the U.S. Chinese American Railroad Society is working on placing a major piece of sculpture, perhaps at the Dutch Flat Rest Stop. This is a picture of it. It's currently at the California State Railroad Museum. Beautiful piece of sculpture showing the work that's been done. I'm not quite sure if it's going to end up in the rest area or if it's going to end up at Promontory Summit. I've heard stories both ways. But anyway, wherever it is, it'll be something well worth seeing if you have a chance to see it. So in addition, there's been a major study recently completed of the work of these Chinese railroad workers. Two professors at Stanford University, Gordon Chang and Shelley Fishkin, have collaborated with a number of historians and other researchers throughout the Western United States, in fact, all of the United States, as well as China, to come up with a major study. And they've documented much of this. Gordon Chang actually wrote a book called Ghosts of Gold Mountain, which goes into a lot more detail than I can cover in this time. And if you want it, well, it's well worth getting that book. It's a readable book, and I think you'd enjoy that. There's also another book in which Gordon Chang and Shelley Fishkin were the editors, and it's a series of articles about the findings of these researchers. So if you're more academically oriented, you might want to get that book too. Okay, well, now, if you have any questions, let's leave that open. And Jeremy, you want to go from now?
Thank you so much, Jerry. I'm coming back here. Let me put my screen back on. Yeah. Well, this concludes our episode of the Sierra Speaker Series with Jerry Blackwell. Jerry is president of the Truckee Donner Railroad Society and acting chair of the New Museum of Truckee History. He has done research, written articles, and made presentations about the transcontinental railroad, the Truckee to Lake Tahoe Railroad, and the area's logging railroads. He also teaches economics at Truckee Sierra College. Previously, he was board president of the Sierra State Parks Foundation and one of the founders of the Donner Summit Historical Society. Please visit donnersummithistoricalsociety.org for more information. This interpretive presentation has been brought to you by California State Parks and the Sierra State Parks Foundation. Please donate to the Sierra State Parks Foundation today to support the interpretation, restoration, and preservation of the park system in the Lake Tahoe Donner area. Your tax-deductible donation will be kept locally and applied to priority projects. Please visit sierrastateparks.org to see how you can get involved and access a full list of upcoming events. Feel free to contact me, Jeremy Lin, at Donner Memorial State Park with any questions. Jerry will remain online for a little bit to answer any questions. And thank you so much, and see you next time.
Okay.
All right. That was really great. Excellent.
Oh, good. I hope it didn't